Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's really nice to be here.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be here as well. Um, I think we've had a very pleasant time at Ake Festival, and I think the sessions yesterday were really, really interesting. Thanks, Lola, for putting this together and for also inviting us to be here. Can we give her a round of... should we go ahead and...
Okay, so I think, can we roll the slides, please? So we intend to have like a very short presentation before we get into, a panel discussion. And we are really hoping this session can be as interactive as possible. We really like to just get into everyone's minds and see what we think about, what we think about environment and economy. So there's a question here, and the question is also the topic of the session. Will we see inclusive economic growth in our lifetime? By show of hands, please, a yes or a no. How many people think we'll see inclusive economic growth in our lifetime? Okay, thank you. How many of us believe, it's a far-fetched idea? Oh, yeah, okay. Thanks for the honesty and the candor. We hope by the end of this session, we'll at least manage to convince you, and at least maybe open up your mind a little bit more as the case is. Yeah. I think I would like to start by just really speaking to, just our reality as a group of people, our reality as Africans, our reality as Nigerians, and just the general state of our society, in itself. We live in a world now, or we live in a continent where it's really, really dire with, a new buzzword, which is multidimensional poverty. Now, they say, a significant amount of Africans are multidimensionally poor. The interesting thing about being, below the poverty line, being poor versus being multidimensionally poor is like multidimensional poverty is like onion. So what that means is even if you solved one, there was still another one to solve. So if you give a multidimensionally poor person free education, that didn't really matter because they were still poor. If you give them free education and free healthcare, it didn't really matter because there was still poverty. If you gave education, healthcare, and possibly access to the market, there was still some form of poverty, poverty in there. And according to stats today, at least 56.5% of the entire world's multidimensionally poor reside in Africa. If you took that and you kind of just really stretched it to even our own environment, Nigeria is possibly the 8th most populous country in the world currently. So what that meant was a lot of these stats that you find in Africa, a significant amount of that number resides in Nigeria in itself. At least 12.2% of the world's poorest also live in Nigeria, currently. Stretching that a bit further, at least about 8.7% of that number globally reside in the northern Nigeria. And just a little bit below that, reside in the southern Nigeria and as well as in the FCT. So that's like the reality of what we find in Africa. If you hear the African narrative is a narrative that, has a lot of aid. There's just a lot of, let's give aid to Africa, let's support Africa and all of that. But the truth is, we are also equipped with a really, really young and thriving, population. The population in Africa right now, and if you look at Nigeria particularly, a significant amount of our population, over 70% of our population is less than 30 years old. That says something. That says if the question we asked initially, if it was entirely possible to find out, inclusive and economic growth for people, to a very large extent, you can actually change the course of a nation, as the case is. More than 89 million Nigerians are between the ages of 18 to 45, which you could have thought, that was our working population, and that's just the population of Nigerians that can do work, as the case is. According to the UN, Nigeria's population and Africa's population is going to double by 2050. Now, there are two ways to think about this. It's either the multidimensional poverty in itself is going to double, maybe triple by then, or we basically, for lack of a better word, weaponize this thriving population and ensure that we can actually use it to, just really turn our economy around as the cases. What you find as Nigeria starts to a very large extent is what you find all over Africa as well, to a very large extent. Also, Africa also represents, that continent that is filled with a significant amount of potential. Right now, between 40 to 60% of all of the arable land, which is the land that you can actually farm and grow food, is actually in Africa, right now. Also, if you think about just the amount of natural resources that we also have in Africa, I think about 69% of the world's platinum deposits is in Africa. About 50% of the world's diamond deposits is in Africa. About 25% of the world's gold deposits is in Africa. We all use phones today. If you picked up your phone, all right, any phone, regardless of the manufacturer, all of the semiconductors, the chipsets, the bulk of the materials they use, whether it was lithium or tantalite, or all of those materials, a significant portion of them are from Africa. So how do you have a continent or a nation that has this amount of, just potential and resources, this potential in human capital, but we still have, just to a very large extent, this multidimensional poverty reality? I think that's really what we really want to talk about today, and really looking forward to it. Now, we have a certain type of behavior in Africa, or particularly in Nigeria. We are largely a consumption-driven economy. So, if we look at almost all of us that are Nigerians or Africans here, pretty much everything we wear, everything we eat, pretty much everything we use to a very large extent is imported, right? So we live in a very heavily consumption-driven economy, as the case is. In fact, there's a stat that says 85% of everything we eat in Africa, in the cities and all of that, are all imported and from outside of Africa, as the case is. We also just import, we don't necessarily export and things like that. Values are also really decadent right now. There's a significant amount of just a lack of, just self-regulation, as the case is. It's not my intention to really paint a problem, but I just wanted to kind of just really set the tone and maybe to further buttress why you might think, it's not possible. And I'm hoping over the next couple of conversations, we'll show you, if and if not it's possible. So could we go to the next slide, please? Upon dissecting this, and if you just kind of just looked at the human behavior in itself, and you think about the potential and all of that, part of what you find, right, is to a very large extent, poverty in itself is not a problem. It's just an outcome or an output. And the real problem in itself is really behavioral problem. Now, if you think about our behaviors in itself, our behaviors are largely an output of our conditioning, right? So what are our conditioning? Whether it was the upbringing or the environment or the society and things like that. Those are really the things that really kind of just, shape and affect our outcomes as the case is. Per dictionary definition, they say your behavior is often defined as how you act or conduct yourself. That's pretty much how behavior is defined. But the truth is, behavior is truly an output of who you are, what you know, and what you've been through. Those three realities in itself are the things that eventually inform or shape our behaviors or shape who we are. So whether it was our identity, where you were born or how you were born, or it was just your condition, your environmental condition or your socioeconomic condition, or your conditioning, just how much society or how much just your environment in itself has really, kind of just affected you, or your education experiences and just every single thing around you. Those are the things that truly shape behavior in these cases. But the behavior in itself, and if you think about just whether it was a stat that I kind of shared or just this conversation around behavior, it forces the question, how did we get here? If we are students of history, there are school of thoughts that believe civilization in itself started from Africa. If you deepen into things like Timbuktu, deepen into the North African history in itself, you find that things like mathematics, things like science really originated from those places. So how did we kind of just really start with a lot of potential and just find ourselves in this scenario as the case is? I think 4 key things beyond any other thing, right? If we attempt to just go back to the first principles and just really leave everything that we're seeing and just kind of just go back to the first principles, one of the things you find is the concept of slavery, the concept of slave trade, the concept of yeah, let me just call it slavery in itself, was very, very disruptive to us as Africans. I don't even want to go into just maybe the secondary or the tertiary impact, but I think at the primary level, what you find is he eroded trust among people. He eroded trust among tribes. He kind of just really eroded the form or the structure that a group of people, a colony of people, typically had prior to them. Then tribe and religion in itself continues to divide us. You find scenarios where people are not really tolerant of each other. People are not really, can't just really get along. And if you try to get to the bottom of it, is either tribe or religion or just something that, frankly, is, I don't mean to be politically incorrect, but really superficial in itself. Because if you think about it, to the basics, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But that's our reality today. Then ignorance leads us. There's a funny saying that says, if you want to hide anything from a black man, hide it in a book. If you want to keep anything from a black man, put it in a book. Depth is really, really missing in our society today. Just the ability to just go in depth and just really, yearn for knowledge. And that's really part of why I really love what the arcade team is really doing and LS. I'm kind of just really trying to just really, elevate our level of consciousness as a group of people. And I think the overall implication on a lot of this is poverty in itself really, just lives with us, as the case is. I think I'll leave it here and maybe Yomi just kind of just takes it along. Yeah.
Thanks, Seinde. Okay, I think the simplest way to say this is that our reality as a group of people is an evidence of, or a reward or consequence of our behavior and the behavior of our society. So if someone was poor, it wasn't just because of their own behavior, it was also because of the behavior of everyone around them and the society they live in at large. And what we have in itself is a family problem. A family of problem. Do you mind if you go to the next slide? All right. So I think there are other participants in society, but just going to speak about three of them in particular. I think government in itself is often the symbol of leadership in every society. In reality, government is meant to define society behavior and regulate it through laws and the consequences they apply on it daily. But even though we have a lot of potential, we have a government generally that just doesn't work within its means and has a reliance mindset. And that's why pretty much maybe aid and loans are just by default an African thing. I think just a couple of days ago, I think it was Malawi that got a loan from IMF, and there was a huge celebration at the house about this new loan that the continent the country had just received. At the second level are market players, the forces of demand and supply, those who do business, those who create jobs, and because of the example set by government, which is the leadership of society, you also find that many businesses don't want to thrive within their means. So cutting corners is almost like a fundamental part of the market landscape. Then the last participant, which every one of us belong to, humans, also generally had to live within means, and even had to live with means. And also what you find is just a mentality of what we call hustle. If you ask anyone who was a Nigerian spirit, or you'll find that we're really strong hustlers. But a lot of it stems from, and if you go into any society, especially if you live in Lagos, you go into any other society and it was slower, there was some sense of they were not human enough or they were not fast enough. But almost a sense of humanness in itself gets lost because of the society we belong to. Is it possible to turn all of this around? And I know this will be an extended conversation into the panel, but just want to pretty much maybe share some thoughts that could lead it on. And let me start from science. We're engineers by training, and science and engineering has advanced heavily around the world. And it provides an opportunity to solve some of the fundamental things that pretty much impacts our behavior and prevents us from growth. And I'll say the number one part of it is access. Science can enable equitable access. So even though it may not be possible for everyone to, or for government or the resources we have to lead us to building all of the health infrastructure we require or education infrastructure we need, technology could be a means to provide equitable access to people or for people for very social needs that will help them elevate themselves, to gain skills, to advance their knowledge, to even have market access. Science can really, really elevate that problem. The second part of it is intelligence. Science, the basis of it is often called ones and zeros. Anything you put in, you get out of it, input and output. But science has evolved beyond input and output. It's evolved to learning from many ins and many outs in a bit to provide intelligence to people. If you all remember the world before Google Maps, and you try to drive around Lagos, you pretty much just stop to ask someone for a direction in every corner. And they may mislead you, you probably can't tell. If you live possibly in a developed city, you probably have a pocket map that you're looking to use to navigate to go from one place to another. But because of the advancement in science, you can now put an address in a Google map and it can tell you the exact steps you can take to get there. So if we're struggling with thought or knowledge or education, science is a means to pretty much democratize access to intelligence. And I think there's a lot of advancement in that area. The last is direction. Growing up, I went to a science college, and one of the fundamental things you're taught is curiosity, to learn, to research, to try to figure things out. However, that served for me as a foundation of just being an engineer. But increasingly, it's becoming very hard for people to find affordable or good education. And if you recall the last statement I made about your reward and consequences, or your reality, is not just a function of what you do, it's also a function of what everybody around you does. We want so many people to have access to direction. And the advancement in science, deep learning, machine learning, and deep learning particularly, offer us an opportunity to learn and provide people direction better. But I think this in itself is not enough, and there is a combination of what heart has to do in attempting to lead us forward in a bid to address this problem of solving for behavior. As much as science can help shape action, art can help shape thought, and can help inspire a person to believe in something. Art can help shape the understanding of what the person perceives life to be, and art can also help nurture a person into a state. I think in between the combination of art and sciences itself, we have an opportunity to reorganize, recreate, or orchestrate behavior that can lead to economic growth or can lead to better outcomes for people. I'm looking forward to the extended conversation about can we solve this problem, and is there an opportunity in science? And hopefully we'll ask this question again at the end of it. Would we see inclusive economic growth in our lifetime? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, Auntie Lola, and thank you very much for your presentation. That was excellent. My first question actually goes to Mr. Suleiman. I want to ask him what he thought of the presentation, if you have any immediate thoughts that came to your mind as these two men gave their presentation.
Okay, as the lovely slides were passing by, there was something that I needed to check. I needed to look at my data. They talked about all the assets, all the natural resources that we have. Something that they did not mention was that 22% of the global youth population are in Africa. Right? We're about 1 billion people today out of 8 billion, but we have 22% of global youth population. To my mind, that is our greatest natural resource, and that is sort of will anchor my contribution to this conversation. Which I was going to start with a little quote that I put up a while ago. He said, people do not decide their futures. They decide their habits, and their habits decide their futures. I think that quote is attributed to Matthias Alexander. And to me, the question we should be asking is, do we have the habits that can ensure we see inclusive economic growth in our lifetime? So we are here to evaluate our habits, not the outcome, not the end game, right? Inclusive economic growth is, okay, will Manchester United win the game? At that point, there's nothing left to do. 2-1, they've won. But do they have the right goalkeeper? Do they have the right coach? Have they built the team? If we talk about that, then it's easy to answer the question. Also, there's also a conversation about, is it possible? The key word is possibility. Is it possible to have 2 more Nobel laureates in this room, from this room, in the next 5 years? It is possible. The current habits of the writers in the room, will that lead to 2 more Nobel laureates? I don't know. So for us, what are the habits today? And we were having a side conversation, and I sort of mentioned to the team that, look, for me, there is a couple of things to look at. The first one is, what gives economic growth? What is the most fundamental thing for economic growth? I think it is acquiring the skills that leads to productivity, right? It could be skill as a footballer, it could be skill as a technician, it could be skill as a writer. If the skills are well distributed, if there is no gender disparity in skills acquisition, if there's no geographical disparity in skills acquisition, if we don't have generational disparity, then you're going to have an inclusive access to opportunity. So the first part of it is that, what are we doing today to ensure that people have the right set of skills? I think that the model for skills acquisition is broken, and maybe I'll have a chance to talk about that later. Then the second thing is about access to information, both before skills and after skills. Before skills is information that tells you what kind of skill you should acquire and where to acquire it. After skills acquisition, it is information that tells you where the opportunities are, right? And finally, it's about access to markets. Because you can have all of that skills. If you do not have access to apply your skill to create value somewhere, then you are unemployed. And I think that is where one of the greatest transformational opportunity exists today. The barriers to market is collapsing. And it is collapsing because it's now increasingly possible for people to live in one continent and work elsewhere. That the greatest thing, and I think Africa stands to be the greatest beneficiary of the COVID lockdown, which put to lie the idea that you could not work remotely and that you had to emigrate physically out of the continent to be able to be part of the global value chain. I can have a conversation around the skills acquisition side, but I think I will stop here. There is something very threatening about the numbers running in front of me. So I'm going to stop here and let others have a contribution to that.
Yes, I had no idea until now. They're actually counting you down here. So I'd love to hear what you thought of Mr. Suleiman's words, especially because I know in your presentation you mentioned how I think 70% of Nigerians are under 30 years old. We have a youth population that continues to grow. So, what do you think about that, and how can you apply it to what Mr. Suleiman has said? This question is for both of you.
Thanks, Aisha. I think I completely agree. And if we had stretched the presentation a little bit, we would have also presented that. But we wanted to kind of just speak about the problem, and we align on it. Our population today, if you think about it, they are our greatest resource. I mean, every organization, every group of people, the people in itself is its greatest asset. So I completely agree. Now, skills, the access to it, the acquisition of it, and the right application of it, as the case is. I think science and technology as well has made that, really easy to conceive, really easy to measure, and also really easy to deploy to people. So I think I completely agree. The right type of skills, as well as just the right media to deploy it.
Thank you. Thanks, Aisha. Thanks, Suleiman. I think just to buttress Suleiman's thought and Seinde's thought as well, I think Africa is the most skewed towards the age that we live in. And if you think about 22% of the world's young population live in Africa, every other continent is skewed towards old age. And when I mean old age, I'm not just referring to age as a number, I'm also referring to times, where in a time where we have never seen this level of advancement in science, we've never seen this level of advancement in how ubiquitous the mobile phone is in the hands of everyone. We've never seen this level of advancement in how fast the internet is getting to almost everywhere. And I would say one of the pride of a place like the United Kingdom is its rail track and how it leads almost everyone everywhere in a very precise manner. The rail track of today's world and of this age really is digital. So if by design we have a young population, it means that we're the most prepared for the rail track that exists today. The beauty about this rail track is it gets to everyone's home, it gets to everyone's hand, and if skills were needed, through this rail track, you can now make skill a lot more equitably accessible to everyone. If healthcare was needed, through this rail track, you can now deliver healthcare to a lot more people. Something that always amazes me, and maybe I looked a little closely into during the beginning of COVID, was the healthcare infrastructure of Lagos. For the first time, I was away from my family. I was kind of like trapped here, and I was like, okay, so if something went wrong with me, let me even kind of like check, how will I deal with this? And I started to learn about some interesting facts. Lagos, for example, maybe has about 50,000 beds, hospital beds, for a population of about 23 million people. And so if more than 50,000 people were ill in Lagos, there was no health infrastructure to accommodate it. But interestingly, on the other side, 60% of people who go into the hospital go for basic care. They go for vital signs, malaria, things you can pretty much take offline, pretty much take out of the hospital, really, and put on the digital rail track. So I think because we're the most prepared for the time we're in and the time we're about to enter, it's no more just a desire that Africa is going to be great. I think it's actually possible now. Maybe 10 years before now, I probably would look at this the other way around. I think it's actually possible now to get things to people, whether it's skills, whether it's opportunity. I think the summary really for me is that it's now possible to live in an equitable world because of the digital infrastructure that we have, and it's growing so fast. And it's pretty much the only thing government can control, big corporates can control. Like the power of a person waking up in their home with a laptop has now gotten to a whole new level. And I mean, I want to kind of like just use that to buttress and align with what I think Suleiman and Seinde has shared. All right, thanks.
Thank you very much, Yomi. And I'm hoping we'll actually lead to this conversation on skills acquisition, because I really want to touch on that. During your presentation, you showed us this pyramid where it was humans, economic players, and then the government. And it explained how at each level you could either succeed or the society can be broken. My question to you is, what drives that pyramid? Is it the individual humans who are making individual choices every day? Or is it from the top? Is it government, our leaders? Are they the ones who have to implement the processes in order for humans to be better? Or is it the economic players who sometimes can operate outside of the system? Please, would you like to go?
Okay, I guess I'm going to have to step back a little bit to say, even though we've itemized all the possibilities, we looked at the resources, we looked at the young people, we also need to understand we operate in a global system, and that what serves the rest of the world may actually hurt Africa, and that the rest of the world works very hard to protect its interest. So let's be clear, nobody wants to see Africa process its lithium into batteries at this point, because if Africa could process all of its lithium into batteries, there's a dramatic change in the economic state of the world. If we could process all of our cocoa into chocolate, it's the same thing, right? So let's not be naive about this idea of, okay, we've got it all, we've got everything, let's just go. So that's one. And the second thing is that we're no longer in the space where people will come in here with magazine guns and take over the place, right? But they can still come into our head. And they are in our head. And that for as long as they're in our head, we will not make the kind of decision, the kind of habits that we need. So the habits, two set of habits I'll talk about briefly. How do you prove you're a successful person today? in an average African country, I guarantee you it ties to consuming something foreign. It ties to sending your children to school in foreign schools. It ties to taking vacation in school. It ties to driving an expensive foreign car. There's almost no part of it. Even the house that you live in, the architecture of the house has to be, I don't know, somewhere from abroad. So they're in our head, right? So that conversation continues about the exploitation of Africa. And the only way that we can satisfy what is in our head today is to effectively give the resources to them on terms that are comfortable, right? So let's put that aside. We won't dwell on it, but let's be clear about that. The second part of it is that, and this then comes down into the pyramid. We've inherited a system that meant that those at the top, and in our case now is the political class, have inordinate amount of power over the action of the rest of us, even where they have no capacity to produce. So when I hear people talk about we need to be more of a production economy than a consumption economy, what they are saying indirectly is that we need to have a smaller government, because the government is not a production entity, it's a consumption entity. Until they start to have a conversation about a smaller government, because think about it, all the economies that have grown grew with very light regulation. No economy, no sector you can go into globally today that has it golden era during heavy regulation. Unfortunately, we are being burned, our sectors are being brought up in the heaviest of regulation because the government enjoys regulation. That's the sources of their power. And once they take on regulation, they create this, effectively they kill the sectors, right? The only time you see a sector pick up is a sector like the fintech, where they were unaware and suddenly there's a huge amount of growth. Now the regulation is coming in. Or in some cases, to give credit, a sector like telecom, where they were very deliberate in regulation. I was speaking to one of the most senior executives in telecom recently, and they said the foundation that was laid for telecom regulation by the first NCC chief is still holding, but it's falling apart a little. That is the reason why the telco have grown. So, right, let's be clear also as what we take in everything. Oh, IFRS 9 is, there's an accounting graduate here. They say IFRS 9, we jump on it. They say, Basel 3, we jump on it. Some of these things will kill us. Our economy is not in a situation where it can take the cost of this regulation yet. And our government love regulation, so they will take it on board, right? And so, yes, the pathway forward for us is to recognize that the entities, the baseline entities, whether it is a gated community, whether it is a literary society, whether it is a corporate, every one of us needs to start to think of ourselves as the ultimate decision-making, because we cannot change the top. We have to improve ourselves before we can change the top. And so the power genuinely can lie at the baseline. Okay, it's on the back of technology, someone with a computer, like you said, but on the back of community, we need to recreate communities that are more powerful than the government.
Well said. Very, very well said, Mr. Suleiman. Do you have any comments on that, both of you?
Let me buttress that. I think I want to pick from the last thing you said, which is that Nigerians make up Nigeria. Nigeria doesn't make up Nigerians. And oftentimes, I feel like when we talk about our leadership, we don't point and high on ourselves, because we are our leadership is a reflection of who we are. As much as we think that it's because of them that who we are. If you think about almost everyone that is in a leadership position in Nigeria, I don't think there's any proven fact that anyone came from anywhere else apart from Nigeria. They grew through the system, and they became who they are to lead our society. And if we want to see the changes that will lead to progress, which I believe is everyone's desire, I think it's important to address it at the self level, at the first level of self-regulation. Mr. Suleiman did say, habits in itself pretty much gives birth to the outcomes of your life or to the outcomes of your society. And if we manage to get government to a place where the laws of our society starts to govern our habits, there's this saying that almost for every 11 people in the UK, there's a camera. And that pretty much conditions how a person thinks about even surveillance or about society. So if we can get ourselves to a place where the laws of our land becomes almost a guiding principle, or becomes gets to a place where it becomes what is orchestrating and guiding our behavior, I think some change can happen. I slightly disagree about naivety. I think naivety in itself is an ingredient for hope. Before you can start to think about something else, you have to first, I guess, start to live in some sort of sense of, wow, my reality doesn't exist. Let me start to think about something else that could bring about change in my life. But naivety, however, wouldn't take us to where we need to go to. We need some sense of consciousness. And what do we need to be conscious about? We need to be conscious about the fact that even though it's no more slavery, maybe physical one, it's not out of the mind. And are we going to invest in our own media? Would we have a source of information that will be different from how we're consuming information today? Are we going to invest in our own social media networks, really, that will provide for us the means and the mechanisms to engage with ourselves and to kind of like build a frame of our own, build a frame of our own mind? So I want to just buttress what he said. I largely connect with it. And I think that if we start to make, I think every ingredient we require to make the change is present. Whether we will mix those ingredients together appropriately at the right time is now left to every one of us to play a role in, just to like contribute to what you.
It's very good, and leads me naturally to my next question, because in your presentation, towards the end, you talked about the importance of science, but also the importance of art, and the importance of festivals like this, like Ake Festival. And I know, Mr. Suleiman, with your work at Sterling Bank, that's something that's very important to you, as a bank, to also invest in creative opportunities. So what role does the creative aspect play in this sort of, inclusive growth? Where can you see creative festivals like Ake or scholarships, things of that nature in expanding economic growth in Nigeria?
Okay, I guess that played that into my hand because I was just thinking about that in my head. There are two stories I can tell you, and both of them will sound true. Life used to be good in the 70s. Life was good, education was excellent, power was working. That's the story you've been told. What nobody has also told you is that in 1970, the total population of tertiary institutions in the country was 19,000 plus. In a population of 57.7 million, only 19,000 people were anywhere near a tertiary institution. Of course, life would be good, right? If we took all the money we had in this room and gave it to one person, the person would be rich. That's the problem, right? People tell you about how the current generation look back sometimes and wonder what the previous generations did. Did you fight? Why are we here? Except for one thing. This generation is fighting police brutality. The generation before that fought military rule, right? They got us democracy, right? The right to write. People wrote and ended up in jail before that. This generation that you look down on, well, without them, you wouldn't even be able to write. But the people died. We marched against the military. But the generation before mine, what did they do for me? They went to war. Right? Right or wrong, whatever side on it you were, they were at war. These people fought to keep a country together. And then the generation before that did nothing for them, well, they took out us independence. They brought us independence. They took us from being a country that was owned by an old woman somewhere down the road to a country that is free to aspire to whatever it wants. Hello? I think people have been making progress, right? And the generation before them, their parents were slaves. Right? So when people think, and if you want to write your story, think of a story as it's a thread. If you draw a thread that is going down, who's going to waste time stretching that thread, right? Think about the graph. But if you think it carefully and you see a thread that moves from Nigeria per capita income 1960 of $93 to 2,100, or life expectation that moved from 36.9 years and is trending towards 60, then you realize that there is a reason. But that is the work of the art. That is the work of narrative. That is the work of storytelling. That is why it is, I get upset when people think that the art It's something you do on your pastime. It is the reason the future will exist. Without it, there is no future. It's the story we tell. And I've been asked many times, why do we support Ake Festival? Well, the truth is that it's not an easy decision to make because it's not a commercial decision. But yet, at the heart of it is the most commercial decision we can make. Because if people had done this 20, 30 years ago, we would have a more inclusive economy today where my business would thrive.
Thank you very much for that. I think in addition, just to also buttress this point and add to, just your question, there's a saying that talent is evenly distributed, but opportunities are not. Ake Festival is a celebration of beautiful minds. And I strongly believe that Ake Festival can inspire anyone, anywhere. All you need is your mind. You don't even need a laptop. You don't even need a phone. All you need is your mind and a pen. And you can truly make magic happen. And that's also part of it. Yeah.
Brilliantly said. So, this one is for Auntie Lola, who keeps saying that this is the last one. I hope you're listening. Okay, so we have...
Just on that conversation about Auntie Lola, I told the team downstairs that this is the last one that is about Auntie Lola. From now on, it's going to have to be about all of us, right? This is now the point where Ake Festival must now become a community asset, and if it lives or dies, it's up to everyone in this room. It's no longer about Auntie Lola.
So wonderfully said, wonderfully said. So we have a presidential election next year. I don't know if you've heard. And, we have a lot of political candidates running for election. I'm going to stick with the presidential ones. If we had the presidential candidates in this room today, and we were asked to advise them on inclusive economic growth and expanding the opportunities for Nigerians, let's take away any context of who those candidates are. Let's not try and bring anything to it. But what would you say to them, to those people who might lead our country? Yes, please go first.
Okay, this was an easy one. I sort of analyzed the spending of government over the last couple of years, and I realized that less than 10% of what government spends goes into the rural area where 50% of our people live. So it's no surprise that those 50% want to come to where the 90% is being spent. Rule number one. Number two, when you now go into the 10%, at least 75% of that, 7.5%, is probably consumed by the men in those societies. So the women, who account for 25% of our population, get 2.5% of what government spend. Yes. About 50% are in the rural area. And of that 50% in the rural area, they don't get more than 10% of government investment. And of the 10% that goes there, at least 3/4 of it is taken by men. So women accounting for 25% of the rural population get 2.5% of government spend. You're wondering why you don't have inclusive growth? Of course, you've excluded them by policy. So rule number one is top line. When you get a budget, cut it. 20% of this budget is going to rural communities, period. Before debt deduction, before interest payment, before anything, 20%. Right? It's going to go into rural communities. Then within that rural community, you can spend what is going to go on healthcare, what is going to go on education, what is going to go on access to market. But at least there has to be a commitment to make the rural economy viable. That's my number one advice. My number two advice is that the privilege of a tertiary education, it's no longer within the power of the government to make it equally available. So today it is made available to the few. Because there are 2 million people in a population of 200 million in tertiary education. Government pays for about 95% of those who are in government schools. It is not available to everyone. Who are the people that is made available to? Those whose parents are wealthy enough to afford higher quality secondary school. They're the ones that do well in JAM. They're the ones that do well in WAEC. So what you've done is you've created a system where the government subsidized tertiary education is only accessible to people whose parents are upper class, doing well, or they struggle, but at least they are better than the rural and the poor. That model itself is the basis for unequal access to opportunity. What do you do about that? Take that funding and use it to equalize opportunity. make it possible for every single person to be able to get their kids to have an education that is good enough for them to be able to compete for the tertiary, and then create a private sector model. If we think education is an investment, then it can pay back. What makes an investment is that you can put $10 in it and get $15 back. Put 100 naira, get 200 naira back. So it can pay back. If it can pay back, let the beneficiary of the education be the one to pay back, not the society, because the society cannot afford to pay back for everyone. Again, these are the things that we take and we are not ready to deal with, but they are destructive to the idea of equality. So 2 ideas: put money in the rural communities. Secondly, make education more available, but not just the kind of certificate-led education that we have now. It is going to be job-led education. In other words, let education happen in the place of work. Education happening in ivory towers is designed for you to become a professor. Education that happens in Sterling Bank is designed for you to become a banker. That's the kind of education we need.
Amazing, amazing. I'd love to hear your thoughts from a tech perspective, because I know that you work in fintech. Fintech is something that's growing in Nigeria. Is there something that you would tell the candidates if they were sitting here today?
Thanks, Aisha. I think there will be no fintech without education. Let me first of all start from there. And I want to buttress what Mr. Suleiman has spoken about as investing in rural areas, as break down the population. So our problem size is too massive, and it's better if you break them into smaller components. And that's really what rural is about, or the various tiers of government. How do we move our problem size from this massive health problem, or massive education problem, or massive power problem, to a power problem in a community, to a power problem in a... So just break down the population and break down the idea of development into smaller populations. Second will be, make sure we get everyone to get access to childhood education, get government's money out of higher education, in my view, and transfer it to industry. The reality is that, I don't know how interviews go with you, Mr. Suleiman. We could put out a job and we can have 7,000 CVs or 7,000 applications for 2 roles. And you spend time going through these 7,000 applications, and you still need to go do a second round of asking for applications, right? So it means that if we're not satisfied with the people that are sending to us from schools, don't worry, I can actually teach them what I need them to learn myself, right? And maybe if education gets transferred to industry or get partnered with industry, we can give these people more practical skills that can earn them a living and earn them a real skill, really. I think that'll be the second thing. The third thing I would like to say is that government should get out of business completely. Government has no business in business. We can't live in an effort society. We just need to live in an outcome society. Don't pay anyone for any business opportunity, for any contract, for any... Just create incentives that ensure that people go invest their money and the outcomes show up. And don't even be involved at all in any business. Don't build roads. Don't build infrastructure. Just create the mechanism for those things to happen and govern them through your incentives and through the laws. We can't abandon the law. I want to say this lastly. We can't abandon the law. We need to live in a lawful society. Someone needs to, once again, pull off those canes and get us into a lawful society where there are rewards and there are consequences for actions. And that'll be like my contribution. I think that will help fintech.
Yeah. I think I'll pick it from the last thing you said, or the second to the last. Government literally has no business in business. Government should just focus on the rule of law, focus on security, and focus on creating an enabling environment. And I think every other thing, the society in itself, will naturally provide equitable growth for us as an economy. And I think second advice I'll give to the candidates will be to really focus on human capital, but tactically focus on human capital. Sometime a bunch of years ago, about 5, 6, 7 years ago, we had an opportunity of working with a development enabler to hire about 500,000 people, train all of them, and put them into jobs. Put them into jobs for about a 24-month period and paid them. Now, we didn't just do that, we also followed the money. So you could, just like you're speaking about rural, there's a particular lady who literally goes to the top of the hill in Plateau State to get signal for her phone. That was how she got to apply for the job. That was how she got to know she had gotten the job. And every month, that's how she goes to get her alert, or her salary payment, or confirm her salary payment. But I think the point is, if you genuinely focus on human capital in a very tactical way, and you get, I mean, all of the nepotism and everything out of the way, there's a significant amount of growth you'll see. Now, following the money, what we found was there's someone who maybe couldn't afford to, there's someone who called akara for non-Nigerians is a bean cake, right? It's made of beans. You could find someone who couldn't afford to buy akara before, but just because of this, now they can buy akara. Now, you might think it's just the person being able to buy akara, but the farmer can farm more beans. The person that sells oil can sell more oil just because the demand at the microeconomy has increased or has changed. Focusing on human capital and really, really driving it has immense value, I mean, even down to the microeconomy in ways that we can't even begin to imagine. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was great answers from all three of you. We have to move to the Q&A portion of the talk now. I hope that there's some lovely questions in the audience. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. And if they are directed at anyone particularly on the panel, just let us know. We'll take the first two. So him and him.
All right. Thank you very much. Wonderful panel. I have a couple of comments and questions. I know
It's just one question, if you can.
Okay, I know Mr. Suleiman loves numbers so much. 22% of global youth population is in Africa. That number is going to actually double by 2060. So what kind of, this population are going to need jobs. Otherwise, they are just going to grow up angry, frustrated, and we might have even more violent societies. So what are the necessary investments that we need to make right now to make sure that those hands are going to be productive and they are going to be well employed and skilled? My second slight question is, I disagree. Government can be an incredible force of good. We just need a government that knows its role in everything that it gets involved with, because governments have a longer timeline than private corporations. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think I'll quickly say that government can be a force for good. It's a question of what will be their role in that for good, right? There are different roles they can play. Back to the, I think that your question is enough on its own. What do we need to do so that this population bulge doesn't become a crisis for us? I think the first thing we must do urgently is to recognize where the opportunities are or will emerge for that population, right? Where will they be needed? Some will say, will they be needed in the farms, or are they going to be needed behind computers, or are they going to be offering services? So that we invest in education based on the projection of where the opportunity lies. The immediate opportunity, and that has to start now, is that there's everybody complains about Jakpa. That is because there's demand for that workforce. The question is, how can we solve that problem without creating the imagined immigration crisis? Let's be clear, if Jakpa continues for another 5 years, they will face a backlash in their home, their new home, that would make them, right? It's inevitable. The way to avoid that is to think of how the services of these young people can be available to the global economy without them necessarily having to relocate from the continent. And there are a lot of skill sets that allow that, right? So the first thing is, let us invest massively in the skill set that means that we can insert our people into the global value chain without our people physically having to relocate, right? And the way we can do that is to not depend on government to fund ASU, to fund education, but instead to create a model that means that a huge amount of capital, local and international, we fund our people to acquire the skills, and then we can insert them. So is it possible? Yes, but it requires us to have action now. And the current tertiary education system cannot produce that workforce. It's got to be a parallel system.
The young man over there. Is there a mic? Okay. Okay. You can go first, and then after that, you will go as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Earlier, well, first of all, the question that was asked earlier is, will we see inclusive economic growth in our lifetime? And many people said yes. I said no, because really it's a question of how old you are. My lifetime, how many years do I have left? So I know certainly I will not see that in my lifetime. But it's good to hear whenever people talk about economic growth and opportunities in Africa, we always talk about the fact that the human capital is the most important resource we have, rather than the oil or other minerals. That is all well and good, but I think we always have to think of the effect of the skyrocketing population growth that we have in Africa. It's okay to have an educated, it's very good if we could have an educated population, but the fact of the matter is, the way our population is going, it's really almost impossible for any government to really give the education that is needed. So it always makes me wonder, which comes first? It's like you ask, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? The government does not have the resources to educate everybody and give them the right opportunities. So why don't we, at the same time, think of how we can bring down our population, or at least reduce the growth rate? I think that is very important, because unless we do that, it's going to be really difficult. Like Mr. Suleiman mentioned earlier, that in the 70s, I think there were just like 19,000 undergraduates, but now we have millions and millions, and we all know resources are not getting any better. In fact, it's the other way around. So really what I want to hear from you is, what do we do about our skyrocketing population growth in Nigeria?
Sorry, I have to jump on that one. The irony is that the most powerful tool for moderating population growth is education. Like imagine all the other we've tried. In China, they had enough power to put a gun to everybody's head and say, if you have a second child, I pull the trigger, right? I think the problem with democracy is that we can't really do that anymore. So the most effective way to moderate population growth, based on all of the options that we've seen, is education, especially girl-child education. How do you get girl-child education? Because the problem is even bigger in the rural area than in the urban. Take resources to the rural. When you take resources to the rural, make sure that those resources go into education, right? So I hear you. Education is not just for skills acquisition, but it's also to change the mindset, because democracy does not allow us to deploy other tools to moderate population growth. Now, the next question then becomes, how do I draw a nexus between human resources and the material resources that we have? The reason why education matters so much is that the value of a ton of cocoa it is determined by the education of those who have contact with it. The person who is a village farmer will sell a ton of cocoa. At best, he dries it on the ground and sell it with a stone. The person who has some level of education, technical education, might process it into some basic form, and so the value goes up by 2 or 3 times. The person who has some more advanced technical education might build a factory. So education again ensures that the value of the other resources are multiple of what we get today. So in a sense, every time you look at what is the single most important thing, if you could do only one thing, I will educate people. Only one thing, because that's the one thing that ties it all together. And that's why we keep going back to it.
Thanks, Suleiman. Really inspiring, just hearing what you're sharing. I think just to buttress this as well, I think it's education. But another question that I want to pose or ask on what you asked is, what type of education do we really need? And is it the same education that we've always had? Because if it's the same education that we've always had, I agree largely with you that it may be almost impossible to get it to everyone in this size of population. But if we map the opportunities that will exist in the future and exist now, we need to train people. Almost in every community in Nigeria, there's some sort of natural resource they have. But the people around that natural resource are not educated to make the best of that natural resource. If it's in Ondo, you find something. If it's in Taraba, you find something. If it's in Osun, you find something. However, everyone there goes on, keep learning biology and biochemistry. We may be disconnected from the resource that they have, right? Or they keep learning, I don't know, just something that just means they're going to end it.
Egyptology.
Yeah, Egyptology, right? That just doesn't even connect to the opportunity around them. So I think if we accept the inevitable, and the inevitable is that we'll be double in 30 years' time, I think our level of illiteracy right now, there's no means to stop that. Because we're not producing goods, we have to be producing children. You know? Seriously. So because if we're not producing goods, it means we're not educated enough. That means we're now applying that energy somewhere else. So it's almost inevitable that we will get to this double population. However, if we're on our way there, are there changes we can make to redirect how our people will learn? The another truth is that the world will need labor. The real question is, what are going to be the times now? Because the world has come to get labor from us before. I mean, I don't think it's new. It was called slavery, it's called brain drain. And, I mean, there's always a new terminology to describe the world asking for labor from Africa. The world will always need labor. We just need to change the terms. I don't even think it's bad that people have the opportunity to go abroad or go work. If you can't control the flow of water, then you build a pipe to direct it. So how many pipes can we build to direct where people are going, what people are learning, what people are experiencing? I think that is achievable. Like, I think that's really achievable. And I'm kind of like looking forward to that word, really. Thanks.
It's a very good metaphor.
Yeah, so I just wanted to add, a few additional things as well, Ma. Back in the day, we had a lot of initiatives. And if you looked at those initiatives, some of them proved to be maybe quite effective. There was a family planning program at some point that it had an impact on our population growth, at least within that period. There was Better Life for Rural Women. There were a number of those things. But the challenge has always been, how do we just consistently continue it? We have a plague of wanting to just restart in Nigeria. So almost every 4 or 8 years, we are kind of just finding ourselves restarting things. And I think stemming those things, figuring out the right type of initiatives to actually implement might be part of lower resistance than attempting to maybe just cut it off as cold turkey as the case is. Then I think secondly, around education, the truth is, I agree largely with Yomi, that we need to completely reimagine education. Today, the National Bureau of Statistics, as our last check, said 49% of our graduates were unemployable. Not that they're unemployed, they're unemployable. What that means is they just went to university for 4 or 5 years to waste their time because they are just unemployable as the case is. If that's the case, we need to really figure out how do we channel our human capital into something different. I remember a day I was going to the office, early in the morning, maybe around 9 o'clock. And I saw this little girl, so like a group of little girls kind of walking to school and all of that. They looked stressed, but what was just playing out in my head is, how many more years does this girl have to do this thing? She looked like she would probably be in like a primary 4, primary 5. So she still has maybe 12, maybe 15, maybe 18 years of doing this thing every day, only to get out of it and become unemployable. I think is really, a painful reality. And it's something we kind of just really need to reimagine. What does education mean? Who needs to go to a tertiary institution? And who needs to really focus on vocational? Because I think, our founding fathers attempted to do it, right? So there were universities, there were colleges of education, there were polytechnics and things like that. But right now, it's just a fad. I just need to go through a tertiary institution and have a certificate. But just returning back to those purposes in itself, or redesigning newer purposes or just reimagining education in a way that fits in the 21st century is a very strong way to actually deal with that and achieve the education in a tailored way. Yeah.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah, my name is Evans Ufeli. I want to state that economic growth is not properly measured in Nigeria. So every time government gets consultants to work these things out, at the end of the day, they cannot diagnose the problem, so they focus on something else entirely. It happened during the trader money and all that. Most of the people that were giving those money didn't need those money. I'll give you an example. I'm a lawyer. I practice in Lagos here. There was a time I had a client in one of the big markets in Lagos. And I charged the client thinking she's a market woman. I don't need to go overboard. Then while I was in the course of processing my brief, we had costs to get her bank statements and all that. And when I saw her inflow and outflow, I said, what? Are you a market woman? She's a market woman. But I cannot diagnose, I couldn't, so I shot myself. The same thing applies to this government and the successive government and the ones to come. The informal sector is not captured. Our economy is actually larger than what we have in the books. But the informal sector is so huge, but it's not captured, so you cannot address it for growth when you don't have the right diagnosis. So my question, therefore, is this. How do we address the informal sector and its growth vis-a-vis the formal sector? Thank you.
So the first thing is that our approach is not to look at the growth figure as published by anyone, right? When you look at multidimensional poverty, you're looking at things that are real. We're looking at the Nigerian Jubilee Fellowship Program. When the UNDP, EU, and the presidency put it together, they wanted 20,000 people for the first cohort. 365,000 people applied. 365,000 graduates that have degrees that are unemployed, right? So those are the things that we need to focus on, the things that we know for sure. And that's why the conversation still holds. However, coming back to, first of all, to confirm that you are right, if you look at the payment data, the formal payment data that goes through banks and other financial institutions is about 2 to 3 times, I think, of the GDP. It is possible that some of the payments do not reflect economic activity, but it is highly likely that at least half of the payments that goes through the payment system, some level of economic activity must have taken place. I don't think people just dashing each other money at that scale, right? So I agree with you, and I think it's important for a different reason. However, for the conversation that we're having here today, the things we want to deal with, they are clearly measurable. We can dimension them. For instance, for an economy to transit into a high productivity economy, you need to have about 5% of your population in tertiary institution. And the type of tertiary institution that leads to job, we are at 1%, we know that. So there is a gap of 8 million people that need to be in school. And when you dimension the 8 million, you start to see where the falling out start. At the last leg is 1.7 million people applies for JAMB and only 400,000 or 500,000 get admitted. So you see the pull off. You now go back to how many move from junior secondary to senior secondary, you see a couple of millions. So when you pull it down, you see the exclusion. And so when we're dealing with this problem, we already know the problem. And I would round up, because I think we don't have a lot of time, by saying there are 2 things that I have been involved in that is intended to help. We have a deficit of minimum 500,000 teachers for secondary, primary and secondary school, and especially at the primary school. But we realize that there are millions of parents that have the capacity to teach at the lowest level, but we're just not equipped to teach. So we're taking the academic content for primary 1 and reducing it into entertainment content that can be mastered by parents and taught to children by simply bringing in the local languages as an overlay. And we're testing it now. We think it's one way to massively improve education when you don't have the infrastructure for formal education, right? So education starts even before you get into a school. At the tertiary level, and this is the last thing that I'll talk about, we've designed a model that is intended to take anyone who can read and write, basic intelligence, between 9 to, I think, 18 months, give you skill sets and make you employable. And we've done that by working with people who have used technology to deliver skills. So people like Nextford, like Decagon, like Old School, we use them on one layer. The second layer is where we're trying to embed these people in a workplace so that they get practical work experience, they actually know what it's like to be at work. And thirdly, and this is very important, because most of our brilliant people are not in campuses, they're actually in the various workplaces, we want to activate them by creating adjunct professorship, which means people like myself, I can take a short course that effectively prepares me to now become a teacher, and I can donate 5 hours a week or 2 hours a week and turn every meeting room in the workplace into a micro campus so that we can decentralize the educational process, take education out of the universities, and embed them. So imagine that a child has spent 3 years, because on the average, a degree now will take about 3 years based on our program. And in those 3 years, they've worked for 3 years as interns. So they've reported to someone, they've been mentored by someone. They've also had the chance of being taught their primary area of study by someone who has both the theoretical and the practical experience. And the last leg of it is we're talking to universities to bring them for a boot camp once in a year, maybe a 6 weeks boot camp. So in a single format, you get valuable academic education, intellectual component, you get work experience, you get physical experience, and it is paid for outside government. It is paid for by bank financing your education. If we do that, then we can scale from 2 million to 4 million to 10 million.
I feel like you're so apt. Like, I don't think there's any more to say to that. I just want to pick a keyword from everything you described and just say it's democracy is the answer. Get it to happen everywhere. In the homes, parents can administer teaching if they can't send their kids to school, if you give them how to do so. Get it to happen in boardrooms, in classrooms. Just ensure that whatever it is we're attempting to pass on to people happens everywhere. I grew up in a house, my mom is a teacher, so like by design, I grew up, listening to my mom teaching me everything. Now I'm teaching my children. My children are actually not in a formal school, right? So, and I feel like if every one of us could become somewhat responsible for this problem, Shanila always says something. He always says that inclusion is the responsibility of everyone. It's not the responsibility of government alone or responsibility of just corporate organizations, from the parents to the churches to the tribal gatherings to anywhere we all exist. Let's just figure out a way to democratize access. I think it's really brilliant or really great to learn the things you guys are doing, especially because of how it's structured across like various classes of people. And I would love to contribute to that in any form that we can. All right. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for the questions, and thank you for listening to the panel, everyone.